Welcome to the Lifeboat Hour with your host, Carolyn Baker.
Everybody knows that the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost.
Thank you for joining us today on the new Lifeboat Hour, where we continue to build lifeboats of sanity for navigating a sea of chaos, especially in an era of potential human extinction. Now, as many of you know, I'm a fan of Brian Swimme, physicist and mathematical cosmologist who has taught at California Institute of Integral Studies for a number of years and whose DVD series, The 10 Powers of the Universe, I've written and spoken about enthusiastically on many occasions. Closely associated with Brian at CIIS is Dr. Sean Kelly, professor of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. He's graciously accepted my invitation to join me today on the new Lifeboat Hour to talk about a number of issues which might best be condensed under the heading of a recent paper he wrote entitled Cosmological Wisdom and Planetary Madness, a topic which I know listeners to this podcast will want to read. Sean Kelly received his PhD in religious studies from the University of Ottawa in 1988. And before coming to CIIS, he taught religious studies at the University of Windsor, the University of Ottawa, and Carleton University in Canada. He's the author of Coming Home, The Birth and Transformation of the Planetary Era, and Individuation and the Absolute, Hegel, Jung, and the Path Toward Wholeness. Sean is also co-editor with Donald Rothberg of Ken Wilber in Dialogue, Conversations with Leading Transpersonal Thinkers, and co-translator with Roger Lapointe of French thinker Edgar Morin's book, Homeland Earth, A Manifesto for the New Millennium. Sean Kelly, welcome to the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thank you, Carolyn. Happy to be here.
Well, in your paper, Cosmological Wisdom and Planetary Madness, you write, "It is a bitter irony of our times that just as the collaborative effort of natural scientists and other researchers have revealed the outlines, at least, of a comprehensive cosmology, we should find ourselves plunged into a maelstrom of unparalleled planetary madness. The madness? Runaway catastrophic climate change, an accelerating mass extinction of species and generalized ecological deterioration, and a brutal empire-driven regime of planetary apartheid. The wisdom? Among the proposals for big history-type grand narratives, Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry's The Universe Story, published in 1992, that I will draw on from these pages. In a story that encompasses the mysterious origin in a primal flaring forth, popularly referred to as the Big Bang, a growing, if perhaps never complete, understanding of the main stages of cosmic evolution, the complexities of embodied intelligence, the main thresholds of human history, and the varieties of cultural expression, a sense of the lure or telos of the evolutionary adventure, and a prescient sense of growing planetary crisis." So, Sean, I'd like to really just dive into the paper, and I'd like to first give us an overview, if you would, of the paper itself.
Well, the starting point, as I tried to express in that was rather probably two long sentences in the opening paragraph, is the unique and paradoxical quality of our moment as a species, where on the one hand, there is a consilience, as E.O. Wilson has put it, among the natural sciences regarding the nature of our universe, the origins of the cosmos, the history of the Earth, the main stages of evolution, and so on. And not only in the sciences, there is we have available to us now the collective wisdom of all of the cultures. Of course, we are losing much as well in terms of indigenous knowledge. We've already lost so much. But still, compared to any other time in our history on the planet, It's as though we are awakening to ourselves in all of our complexity as a species that is integral to the cosmos, integral to the planet, the kind of emergent planetary awareness that is dawning. At the same time that the very basis, physical basis, ecological basis, and even civilizational basis for this awakening is starting to unravel. So my dear friend and colleague Joanna Macy often characterizes it in terms of a race between two movements: the great turning toward a potentially life-sustaining civilization, an awakening of our deeper identity as members of the body of Gaia on the one hand, and the great unraveling, so the very fabric of life unraveling, and civilization teetering on the point of collapse. So this is a truly remarkable tension that we are living in, and unique in our history, and unique in the history of the planet. So that's a starting point. So what I wanted to try to do in the paper is give at least one perspective on the nature of the wisdom dimension. So what are the deep structures, or how can we get a handle on this new awareness, this new planetary consciousness? It's not just knowledge, but a deeper wisdom. How can we get a handle on that, and what is its relationship to the unraveling that we're currently experiencing? Are they just opposites, or do we actually need to think both of them at once in order to realize the wisdom on the one hand, and hopefully, if there is a chance, avoid the worst case scenarios of the madness on the other?
Well, as you know, in my work, I talk a whole lot about holding the tension of the opposites. I'm very Jungian based, and I don't see any other way to gain wisdom than to hold that tension, because if we go with one or the other, we say it's going to be this way or it's going to be that way. That's not wisdom. That's guessing at best. And so I really appreciate the way you are holding both of those.
Oh, thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, as you know, I too have been deeply shaped by Jung. I mean, Jung, I had a kind of very early conversion to Jung, and his way of thinking is deeply woven into my intellectual, spiritual DNA. But one of the things I quickly realized in my path as a scholar was that Jung was actually in a long line of wisdom keepers, East and West, but just thinking in the West, going all the way back to Heraclitus, as I'm sure you know, who characterized wisdom or the cosmic logos or reason in terms of a paradoxical tension of opposites. And that strand, we can see it evolving and shape-shifting over the last couple thousand years, culminating in many ways in the philosopher Hegel, but then being reborn closer to our own times in Jung's psychology of the self, and his idea of wholeness or the self and individuation as a creative, potentially creative tension of opposites. So yeah, I think we've been walking very similar paths, it seems.
Well, I'm looking forward to, in a few moments, talking about Hegel. But first, I wanted to ask you, in terms of your worldview and specifically your sense of humankind's relationship with the cosmos, you have been profoundly influenced by thinkers such as Teilhard de Chardin, Thomas Berry, and of course your colleague Brian Swimme, who was also influenced by Teilhard and Berry. So I'd like you to talk about their contributions to a planetary wisdom culture and how it differs from standard big history, if you will.
What a great question. Yeah, well, Teilhard de Chardin stands out as a really remarkable beacon, a prophetic beacon in the middle of the 20th century, who, although he participated in worked in the trenches in the First World War as a stretcher bearer and saw the absolute horror that humans were capable of, was nevertheless possessed by a vision of the planet awakening to itself, having grown a new sphere along with the biosphere, a term that he helped us understand, but a new sphere was emerging that he called the noosphere, or the envelope of thought or consciousness. And he saw this as portending the next phase in the evolution of the planet and of the cosmos, where human beings would awaken to themselves as truly planetary beings. Now, for Teilhard, of course, this was not other than the true meaning, the mystical meaning of the Christ. For Teilhard, cosmogenesis, or the evolution of the cosmos, is the same thing as Christogenesis, or the birth of Christ consciousness. Now, just as a little aside, Teilhard also recognized that just as the universe is probably chock full of inhabited planets, assuming they reach a certain point of evolution similar to our own, he saw those as also birthing the Christ. So he imagined a potential infinity of cosmic Christ. There's not just one cosmic Christ. It's the deeper evolutionary potential, another word for the deeper evolutionary potential of life itself and of the planet that we're on. So that's Teilhard. And Thomas Berry and Brian Swim are the next two figures in that lineage. They both were heads of the Teilhard Society and deeply influenced by his work and continued it. But I guess the main difference would be that Thomas quite explicitly, and Brian following him, decoupled the Teilhard's view of evolution as a path toward greater complexity in consciousness. They decoupled that from the Christocentric, the theological language of Christianity, and instead focused more on the natural scientific and the broader planetary cultural dimensions to make Teilhard's vision more user-friendly, I guess, in a more diverse, multicultural, multi-religious worldview context. So that's what they did. I mean, they're still very much in the Teilhard line, but with a different inflection.
Yes, and one of the things that has drawn me to Brian's work and Thomas's work, and just putting both of them together, is this wonderful marriage of science and spirituality, which it is so beautiful, and I just keep coming back to it all the time. And I've written about it, and I never tire of listening to both of them and reading how they put these two things together.
I totally agree. I'm always inspired by hearing Brian speak, and love reading Thomas and Brian's work, definitely. So, yeah, I mean, there's a big difference between, you mentioned also that, I think you mentioned, Teilhard was probably one of the first people, and then Thomas and Brian following him, to propose views of what is now sort of popular to call big history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like you to talk more about that, and it sounds like you're going to.
Yeah, so, well, the term big history was proposed by David Christensen in his big fat book called Maps of Time. It's a movement to try to re-embed the sense of human history and what it means to be human in the larger evolutionary cosmic context. And that's, of course, what Teilhard did and what Thomas and Brian do as well. But if you look at the Big History Association and most of the literature that's coming out from there, which, by the way, is generously supported by Bill Gates, the Bill Gates Foundation. So there's a lot of money behind the mainstream Big History project.
Right.
It's a great project. But one of the things that is a little disappointing in the more mainstream Big History environment is a kind of taboo around the words and ideas of purpose and meaning, and certainly spirituality, consciousness, even metaphor. For instance, a little while back, I presented a paper at the Big History Association conference on Gaia. I was the only person in this huge conference to use the word Gaia, and I was roundly criticized by it from several people, not people in the audience, but from the higher ups, I guess, who control the doctrine of big history. So one of the wonderful things about the Teilhard, Berry, and Brian lineage is that they see that big history is great, but if we're only thinking in terms of spatial magnitude and of enormous stretches of time without including the depth dimension, the dimension of interiority and consciousness and meaning and value and purpose as not only equal to the spatial material dimension, but in some sense primary, then we're dealing with a very impoverished view of our own evolutionary inheritance and potential. So rather than big history, some of us prefer the term deep history to distinguish it from that obsession with sort of spatial magnitudes. That's one big difference.
Well, Thomas spoke of the cosmogenetic principle, which you also write about, and I'd like you to explain that threefold principle, particularly in relation to our current planetary predicament, and then also explain how Hegel and Jung might have articulated this.
Okay. Yeah, so so Thomas proposes, well, Teilhard talked about cosmogenesis. So Thomas Berry followed that by proposing, and Brian and Thomas together, proposing this idea of a cosmogenetic principle, which is actually three principles in one, to describe the deep structure of the way the cosmos emerges and evolves. So you could say it's a way of describing the wisdom dimension rather than mere knowledge of how the cosmos works. So three principles in one. It's like a new sort of holy trinity. And the three principles are autopoiesis, or self-organization. You could also think of that as identity. The second principle is difference, or differentiation. And the third principle is communion. So right away, we see a parallel here with the Hegelian dialectic and Hegel's view of wisdom, or wholeness, or spirit, which he defined often in terms of a dialectical relationship between identity and difference. So the basic idea is this, that anything that lives, so all living forms, from a cell to ecosystems to the planet, obviously our own bodies, but also a mind that lives, or a community that lives, anything that is a structured whole. To really understand its life properties, we need to think of that wholeness in a complex way in terms of what Hegel would call a dialectical relationship between opposites. So what are the opposites? Well, the opposites are, to begin with, this principle of emergence, of self-organization, the sheer fact that something is, and the question, how do things come into being? Why did the universe arise? To begin with, how did galaxies form? How did our planet begin, which began as a ball of molten rock, if we could see it in time-lapse photography, suddenly become not only a biosphere, but Beethoven and children playing, and you and I sitting here talking about the nature of wisdom. So the first principle is really the mystery of emergence and self-organization, that you get something apparently out of nothing, or a creative nothingness, that organizes itself as a whole and maintains itself as a whole. So self-organization, that's the first principle. Now the second principle, though, is that this whole isn't just a blank unity. If it's truly to be, if it is to actualize its potential and be able to evolve and change, it needs to have internal differences. It needs to have differentiations between its parts. And it needs to have set itself apart in some way from the environment. Like the cell has a cell membrane that allows it to distinguish what is food and what is not food. The body has an immune system. It makes a difference, a distinction between itself and other organisms and so on. So identity, or selfness, self-organization, can't really exist without difference or differentiation. And now right away we can see how this has implications far beyond biology, let's say, in contemporary politics, where there's a raging debate now whether the European Union can survive the Brexit, the exit of the United States, of Britain. whether the United States should build walls to keep out foreigners. So it's a living, consequential question. How do we relate selfness and identity with difference and otherness? So those are the first two principles, and we always have to think of them together. Now, how we think of them together really only becomes fully apparent when we bring in the third principle, which I know you've written very eloquently about, and communion, the idea, the principle of communion, or living relatedness, self-conscious, creative relatedness. So it's the idea of communion. And in a sense, the communion is there all along. I mean, there is no cell without other cells. There's no fetus without the womb. There's no organism without its environment. All selves are always selves in relation. And that's true of the different parts of ourselves, as well as the relationships between each one of us. So here we have it then. If we are to think through the mystery of life and of our planet and of our communities, we need, as you say, to avoid this tendency to split things into irreconcilable opposites, and rather see them as dynamic relationships between apparently opposite principles. So that's a trinity of principles, the cosmogenetic principle in a nutshell.
Well, I thank you for that. And I was just thinking as you were talking, I'm going to need to listen to this podcast again and again, because what you're saying has such depth. It's so juicy. And I really want to take this in. But, in the paper, you talk about the self-organizing dynamics of Earth and runaway climate change. So I'd like to hear more about that, because there again, we hear the opposites, the self-organizing dynamics and the chaos of runaway climate change.
Right. Okay. So we've got the wisdom and the planetary wisdom and the planetary madness, which are sort of opposites, but they're happening at the same time. Okay. So one of the first principle of the cosmogenetic trinity, self-organization, we see now very clearly for the first time on a collective scale with climate change. Right? Almost everybody now has a sense of what's meant, for instance, by runaway feedback and tipping points. And these are qualities of self-organizing systems which, to maintain their identity, need to maintain certain thresholds of equilibrium. And we know that the climate, for instance, that we as humans have enjoyed for certainly the last 12,000 years during the Holocene, so all of human history and civilization has arisen within a very stable climate where the temperature was within quite a small margin. And stretching way back further than that, we know that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for instance, which has now just gone past 400 parts per million, hasn't done so in at least 800,000 years. So the idea that in our own time, these thresholds of relationships that have characterized the stable climate are being surpassed and broken, that is causing runaway climate change and global warming. This is now part of the growing collective consciousness. So one of the things that means is that through the crisis of runaway climate change, people are starting to become aware of this principle of self-organization and the subsidiary notions of feedback and homeostasis and critical thresholds and so on, fine-tuning of elements, all of these systems ideas that are the basis of Earth system science, for instance, or Gaia theory, as it used to be called, are the ingredients of self-organization. And that used to be a very esoteric concept and discipline that very few people were aware of. But now it's in the news. It's in the news for everybody to read day by day. So,
right.
Yeah. Mhm.
It's almost as if at the same time that we're getting more chaos, we're getting more sense of the implicate order, you might say.
Exactly. Yeah. As things fall apart, we have a deeper sense of our own interdependence and deeper unity. At least there's that possibility.
Well, I want to remind listeners that you can contact Dr. Kelly at CIIS, that's California Institute of Integral Studies, and his email address is skelly, that's Kelly, skelly at ciis.edu. And if you visit the California Institute of Integral Studies webpage and click on the faculty and staff directory, you can learn more about his work and watch some of his fascinating video lectures. I highly recommend it. So, dear listeners, if I were sitting with you right now, I might ask for a show of hands from people who've ever heard of Dr. Sean Kelly or read his paper, Cosmological Wisdom and Planetary Madness. And I dare say that few of you would be able to raise your hands. And I think you'll agree with me that the human species desperately needs his perspective. We have many guests on this podcast who aren't world famous, but should be because of the clarity and consciousness of the work that they're doing in the world. So today's program is yet another example of our intention here on the Lifeboat Hour to bring you thoughtful, informed guests who can articulate not only our global predicament, but offer us endless tools for how we can respond to it. So therefore, I would ask that when you download or listen to the podcast, you offer a small contribution to our efforts so that we can continue to provide you with this kind of programming. I do this work for you, my friends, and for all living beings. And while it's truly a labor of love, I would really appreciate your donation. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Sean Kelly, Professor of Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness at California Institute of Integral Studies and author of a recent paper, Cosmological Wisdom and Planetary Madness. So, Sean, a few moments ago, we were talking about Earth's self-organization and runaway climate change. And following that section in your paper, you talk about differentiation and mass extinction. And extinction is a common topic on the new Lifeboat Hour, but I really want listeners to hear your insights on extinction. So please share them with us.
Wow. Well, I don't know what insights I might have. I could just go, ah!
Yes, couldn't we all? Indeed.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's truly remarkable that our program, for instance, Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness, our mission statement 20 years ago now, began with a recognition of the sixth mass extinction underway. And at the time, we were voices crying in the wilderness. Even though there was a consensus among evolutionary biologists that the mass extinction had in fact begun, there was virtual silence and blackout in the media and almost zero collective consciousness. Well, within the last few years, that has thankfully started to change. Many more people are aware now. They don't maybe quite get the full implications of what it means. But here we are in the accelerating sixth mass extinction of species. The last time that happened, 65 million years ago, long before even our pre-human ancestors walked the earth. So we are alive in this unique time. And of course, we don't know whether it can be halted. It's radically uncertain, but it's not looking good at this point. So how to understand the drivers of this mass extinction? Why is it happening? Well, at the most sort of abstract level in the paper, I suggest that we can think of it in terms of a kind of runaway differentiation. So if we think of differentiation, the principle of differentiation as essential for understanding any complex whole, we can see what might happen when this principle runs amok, as it were. And how is differentiation, the principle of differentiation, running amok? Well, one manifestation of differentiation is the setting up of hierarchies, of orders, causal orders, sequential orders, spatial orders of difference. And of course, we need some of that. Without difference is only a blank unity. But it's a fact that the last 5,000 years of our history on the planet have been dominated by a certain kind of order, which we could call patriarchy, where the way of the fathers, a certain stereotypical masculine mentality has been dominant. And since the modern period, starting around 500 years ago, that got coupled. And I know you know all of this, but just for the sake of your listeners who
Yes.
might not be familiar, starting about 500 years ago with the birth of the modern scientific worldview, which quickly became the dominant sort of mechanistic, dualistic worldview, that there we see the principle of differentiation taking on an even more pathological dimension. So we don't only have the hierarchical oppression of the masculine worldview over the feminine, but we also have the dominant European white over the rest, and we have a certain kind of human instrumental, rationalistic, mechanistic thinking over the more organic, relational thinking. Now, this in itself is bad, but once it got coupled with the dominant way of doing business in the world, i.e. capitalism, we get what some people call industrial growth society that leads to a explosion of population, but which is bad enough. But when world population is coupled with a way of relating to the earth as, in Thomas Berry's words, a collection of objects that are merely there to be used and consumed, we get the unraveling of the biosphere. So, in trying to understand the drivers of the mass extinction, we can think of runaway differentiation, but that's very abstract. I think it's maybe more helpful to see how this runaway differentiation is being used by the dominant way of being in the world, which is really, on the one hand, mechanistic worldview, co-opted and used by global capitalism. And of course, the global capitalist framework is interested in only one thing: maximizing profits. And to maximize profits, you need to have ever new markets, ever new stuff. And the only way to keep that going is to race to plunder and use what's left of the biosphere. So this, to my mind, is why we're in the midst of a mass extinction of species. We could think of it very abstractly as runaway differentiation, but in fact, the way that has been played out is through the coupling of the dissociated, dualistic, mechanistic paradigm with patriarchal mindset and a capitalist way of being in the world. Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And, as you were talking, I was thinking about a three-part series that my colleague Ivy Cohn and I have been doing on this podcast called First Aid for Cataclysm. Ivy is also a big fan of Brian's work and Thomas's work. And so we're talking about tools for how we respond. And I was just thinking as I was listening to you that you said something earlier that I think is key, I think is at the core of how we need to respond. And maybe the most important task for any of us is to really learn on a deep level what it means to be human. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Wow. Yeah. Well, I guess there would be two sides. On the one hand, really to be human. As our friend Brian loves to remind us, and so good at doing, to be human is to be that part of the cosmos and of Earth that can awaken to herself
Yes.
in all her mystery and complexity. So to be fully human, in a sense, is to be fully Gaian, to be fully planetary, to be fully cosmic. And what does that mean? Well, it means that we have untold capacities for creativity, for emergence, for beauty, for love. But we're also finite beings that we have the capacity to make mistakes, for error, for delusion, for ignorance. So part of the human condition as a finite being is to have to deal with, in Jungian terms, the shadow. I mean, you speak about this so well in your paper on Mad Hominem. That to be fully human, one of the things it means to be fully human is to awaken to the paradoxical quality of our consciousness, which is perhaps the brightest light that we know the cosmos has given birth to, that comes at the same time with the deepest shadow.
Yes.
No other being that we know of is intentionally commits genocide, for instance.
Right.
And yet no other being mourns the loss of another species. So to be human is to be capable of infinite love and compassion and truly demonic darkness. Right?
Thank you for that. I love that.
Well, I know that you've been thinking along similar lines for some time.
Yes. Well, on that subject, in 2015, I published Love in the Age of Ecological Apocalypse, Cultivating the Relationships We Need to Thrive. And the principal thesis of my books has always been that everything and everyone in the universe is in relationship with the other. And I devoted an entire chapter to Brian's 10 powers of the universe. And in your paper, you talk about communion versus empire, as you call it. Also, you call it planetary apartheid. And from my perspective, we're certainly on the fast track of planetary apartheid and on the very slow track in the direction of communion. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I propose this notion of planetary apartheid instead of global apartheid. I mean, the idea of global apartheid is maybe more well known. Namely that the so-called developed countries in the West exist in a state of relative abundance and privilege by means of the systemic and systematic oppression of the global South, the Third World, and so on. So that's global apartheid. Planetary apartheid is that, but it also includes the recognition that the human species has maintained its position through systematic oppression of the rest of the Earth community as a whole, which includes unbelievable populations of animals, for instance, that we abuse in industrial animal production, food production. But we're destroying the soil, we're eliminating biodiversity in terms of plant crops and so on. So again, this principle of pathological differentiation gone over to dissociation, that we are pushing ourselves away from all of the bonds that in fact define us as human beings. So that's planetary apartheid, and it's a kind of psychotic and even demonic denial of our deeper nature as communal beings. We know that we know what happens to infants who are raised by parents who tragically are not able to nurture the infant by giving them the unconditional positive regard and love that they need. What you get is fragmented babies that grow up as fragmented selves and narcissists and sociopaths, right? We're not capable of the kind of true mutual recognition and love and social being that we need. So communion, in the sense of mutual recognition, of meeting face to face, seeing, as Hegel puts it, seeing the other in the self, and the self in the other. And this is how he defines spirit, by the way. So this possibility for mutual recognition, to begin with between humans, but also between humans and the non-human or the other than human. This is what defines us, defines our deepest potential. Now, yeah, it seems that deepest potential seems to be receding fairly quickly in our own times, in an accelerating manner, with the mass extinction underway, with the refugee crises, with wars brewing, and the military buildup on the Russian border, the tensions between China and Korea and Japan, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't seem very hopeful, and yet, there are countless numbers of individuals and communities. Paul Hawken was the first one in his book, Blessed Unrest.
Right.
The talks that he would give were, behind him would be this scrolling names of NGOs and organizations by the thousands all over the world who are devoted to cultivating an awareness of our true, deeper nature as communal beings. So this is happening. I mean, the students that come to our program, the listeners of the Lifeboat, and we know that they are out there, and they are growing in number. With,
Yes.
The new movement, the movement behind Bernie Sanders' campaign, and the Occupy, and so on. So the great turning is happening, and the great unraveling is happening, and it's a race. We don't know which one will overtake the other. It's radically uncertain, as hopeless as it may seem at times. I do believe it's still radically uncertain.
I like that. Radically uncertain. Radical uncertainty. I may have to start using that phrase more than I'm using it now. You mentioned a moment ago in your remarks, you used the word demonic, and in the paper you quote Edgar Morin, who called us Homo sapiens demons, which sounds a lot like demons or the wise mad animal.
That's true.
You know, many people who are well aware of our predicament and the extent of the rape, pillage, and plunder that humans have visited upon the earth have become misanthropic, or have decided that humans are the lowest form of life in the food chain. And as you know, I wrote an article about this in 2014 entitled Mad Hominem, Why Hatred of the Human Species is Not Useful. So I'd like you to comment on Homo sapiens demons, and also talk about what you call Anthropocene.
I love this term, Homo sapiens, or sapiens, demons, that Edgar Morin coined. Just think of it. The official name of our species is Homo sapiens sapiens. So not only a wise animal, but the wisest among the wise.
Right.
And in some sense, of course, we can see how that's true. We as a species, have produced amazing things in terms of science and art and civilization. And yet, the historical period is a history of ongoing war and oppression, of hatred and murder and pillaging, as you described it. So there is a sense in which what characterizes the human animal versus other animals is not only our capacity for wisdom, intelligence, and consciousness, but our capacity for insanity, for madness, both in the sense that we can fall into states of dissociation where we don't seem to know what we're doing, but also malignant states of being and consciousness where we choose to hurt each other and to hurt ourselves and other beings. So this is a form of malignant madness or insanity. So Morin, whose key commitment is to complexity, the complexity of the real, says that we need to couple the sapiens with the demons. Now, the demons, though, is not just like demented or insane. It is that. But it also suggests the Greek word daimon, which comes out of the Platonic Greek tradition, that describes a deeper nature of our soul that is capable of such things as ecstasy and of enthusiasm and of possession, but possession by not only the gods of war and of hatred, but the gods and goddesses of beauty, of poetry. So demon, just as the human has these two paradoxical sides of sapiens demons, demons itself has two paradoxical sides, one leading in the direction of psychotic insanity, and the other, which is the opening to creativity and poetry. Poetry in the deepest sense of poiesis, of the possibility of something new and creative emerging. The idea is not to eliminate the demons, but is first of all to recognize it, to honor it, and here we come back to the idea, the importance of the shadow and of integrating the shadow. So the light of wisdom, of sapience, is doomed to falter, peter out, and become sterile, a kind of sterile ultraviolet light, without the fruitful darkness, as Joan Halifax described it in her autobiography, without the fruitful darkness of the unconscious, of the creative unconscious, of the shadow, of the depth dimension, right? So this is a direction that I like to pursue, the direction of human nature as a complexio oppositorum, a weaving of a fabric of woven opposites that includes light and darkness, wisdom, folly, seriousness and play, and so on.
And so the guy Anthropocene, can you say more about that, please?
Yeah, well, that's a term that's probably that I seem to have coined it. And it may very well just disappear. But the idea behind it is that, with the mass extinction of species underway, and with the ending of the Holocene, so this last 12,000 year subphase of the 65 million year geological epoch that is coming to a close, with this epoch coming to a close, a new geological epoch is beginning. And geologists and others seem to be pretty much have a consensus now to call this new epoch the Anthropocene. So the age of the human. Now, what does that mean? Does it just mean that if we can't halt the extinction and the collapse, that there will be a kind of geological residue of what's left of the cities and the radionucleotides and persistent organic pollutants and so on, that aliens, if they ever come to visit our dead planet, will be able to see as the last evolutionary layer of our planet? Is that all the Anthropocene means? Or does it mean the period where humans finally awaken to their true nature? And if it means that, then I'm suggesting that maybe a more helpful term than Anthropocene would be something like Gaia Anthropocene, which suggests that the human is not other than Gaia, not other than the planet. We are the planet.
Yes.
We've literally emerged out of the molten rock that was this planet, along with everything else that is Gaia. So, and if we are to survive and actualize our potential, it will depend upon enough of us learning and being able to reproduce and act according to the wisdom of Gaia, which is the wisdom of self-organization, the wisdom of the cosmogenetic principle, where you have self-organization, creative diversity in communion, right? Mm-hmm. So if that's what the nature of Gaia is, then the full actualization of the human needs to happen in communion with Gaia, hence Gaia Anthropocene.
Well, my last question for you, Sean, has to do with what you call embracing the Eschaton, a word which means the last days or the end times. So these are the last days of what, and how do we embrace the plethora of endings with which we're being inundated?
Yeah, wow. When you think of it, that, well, first of all, that 65 million year period coming to a close now. we are literally the only humans, and pretty much the only mammals, but certainly the only humans, the only higher mammals that have ever experienced the end of a geological era. But we're also experiencing the end of the Holocene, the last 12,000 year stable climatic period. We're experiencing the end of history in the sense that the script that human civilization has followed for the last 5,000 years can no longer be followed because if we do, we'll just destroy ourselves. So that historical script is coming to an end. We're coming to the end of the ideals of the modern period, and particularly the Enlightenment, that thought that the only way forward is through continued scientific technological progress and material prosperity. That can no longer work. So many endings we are witnessing, converging, multiple endings. We do live in end times. Now, this idea of the Eschaton, or the end times, we inherit through the Christian Bible, and it's associated with especially with the last book of the Bible, Apocalypse, and your book, Love in a Time of Ecological Apocalypse. So we have a sense of one side of apocalypse, which is destruction, judgment. But as you know, the word also means the lifting of the veil, apocalypto.
Yes.
We are in a time, so the end time is a time that the veil or the veils are lifted. And what does that mean? So we have the chance to see each other, as St. Paul puts it. Then we saw ourselves as in a mirror, darkly. Mm-hmm. Now we see each other face to face. So when that veil is lifted, we have the chance to, in Zen terms, see our original face, right? Our original face as planetary beings is as planetary beings with a common origin and a shared destiny. So to embrace the Eschaton, in a sense, is to awaken to, among other things, is to awaken to our common origin, our shared destiny, to the indissoluble bonds of community and of communion that have given rise to us, and upon which we not only depend, but through which we thrive. So this is how I would see embracing the Eschaton, and I see this in your work as well, where we have a choice. We're faced with a choice. We can become suicidal. We can become psychotic and homicidal. We can give up, or we can choose to fight for truth, to speak truth to power, to love each other. We've always had these choices, but now we're being faced with choices that have planetary consequences, and the greatest weight, but also the greatest opportunity that humans have ever been given. So that's what embracing the end time means to me.
Well, I often, in workshops and conversations with folks, I often ask, what if you had a choice to be here at this time? What if you didn't just fall out of the sky at this moment, and there's some purpose in your being here? And you have just beautifully articulated, I believe, why we are here at this time. And a lot of people, insist that there's no point, there's no purpose. But in my work, I really emphasize that there is a point and a purpose, and it's not an accident that we are here now.
I'm with you. I'm with you there.
Well, I want to say to all the listeners of the new Lifeboat Hour, if you want to contact Professor Sean Kelly, his email is skelly, that's SKELLY, at CIIS.edu. And I encourage you to Google his paper, Cosmological Wisdom and Planetary Madness, which can be found in a couple of locations online, and to just, dive into that paper and digest the nutrients that are there. Thank you so much, Sean Kelly, for being with us today on the new Lifeboat Hour.
Oh, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
So until next time, this is Carolyn Baker thanking you for joining us today on the new Lifeboat Hour.
Thank you for joining us today. You can hear all podcasts and learn about Carolyn Baker's other works at www.carolynbaker.net. Her daily news digest is available by subscription and is delivered to your inbox 7 days per week with real news on economics, environment, geopolitics, civil liberties, and cultural issues, plus links to articles on inspiration and resilience. Come sail with us again next week on the Lifeboat Hour.